Here's a quick slideshow on Hellenistic art, particularly sculpture. Your textbook does give a relatively brief discussion of the visual arts in the Hellenistic period. So, of course, have a close look at that. But I think it warrants a little bit more attention, not only because personally I find it kind of interesting, but also because we have been tracing the visual arts and particularly sculpture. That's just a personal one of my interests from Minoan and Mycenaean times, but then especially in the Archaic period. Remember with the kouros, the statues of the young men, and then into the classical period, taking a look at sculpture and the Parthenon, and so on. So I think it's important to kind of trace, to keep this kind of thread alive, if you will, and kind of taking a look at all the art through the period and how it changes and so forth, because it helps you really understand how some of this stuff evolves and will continue on to Rome, because they picked up on a lot of the Greek um, kind of ideals. So where I want to begin here is, again, kind of like actually what I did with the outline of history in this chapter. I want to begin just looking quickly back and taking a look at what's the kind of norm in sculpture before the Hellenistic period. And here, of course, this is review. Remember, when we were taking a look at the 5th century, we took a look at the rise of classicism, both in some of the sculptures that were produced, but then also the Parthenon and the sculptures that decorated it. Right? So remember, when we think of 5th century, we think of classicism. Excuse me. And then, of course, here are two perfect examples of classicism. Right? On the left, the best example of classical sculpture is the Dorophoros, the spear bearer. And on the right, we have the bust of Pericles. And remember, some of the stuff that we're talking about with classicism, usually there's no extremes of age. People are usually, say, kind of, they look like they're in their 20s, right? So there's no really young people, no really old people. They're kind of physically perfect, if you will. Not only the body of the Dorophoros here, but then if you look at the face of both of them, especially the close-up of Pericles here, you can see that there's really no physical imperfections. There's no wrinkles or anything like that. And the other thing is that, remember, there's no emotion. Most of them kind of look this so-called vacant stare, where they're just kind of looking off in the distance. Same thing here. Even you take a look at his mouth, the mouth can display a lot of emotion, right? If it's a frown or if it's a smile or whatever, but there's just nothing here. So it's kind of emotionless. So say you look at a lot of classical sculpture, this is what we're coming from, right? 5th century classicism. Now it's a little bit of review, but the other thing is that you're going to see how dramatically different quite often the Hellenistic period could be. So that's some of the standards. I think the other thing you have to remember here is that when we're thinking about classical art, we're talking about something that is kind of intimately kind of connected to the polis and political life. So the Parthenon, for example, remember, it kind of celebrated the victory over the Persians. It was in some ways a celebration of Athenian democracy, an Athenian empire. And then you take a look at some of the literature that was produced, tragedy, comedy, history, by people like Aeschylus, Aristophanes, and Thucydides. Even the topics in those literary works dealt with kind of pressing political issues. Tragedy, as we talked about, is like a type of civic discourse. Comedy, which we haven't really looked at, but it's much the same. History, Thucydides wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War and so on and so forth. So they dealt with kind of a lot of kind of political issues, broadly understood, things that applied to the entire polis. So in terms of, say, its content and the way it's depicted, this is the kind of norm of classical art, right? Kind of these perfect specimens in the prime of their youth, and then they deal with these kind of timeless issues and issues that are connected to the polis. Now, when we turn to the Hellenistic period, there's a real shift. And I think when you're listening to this slideshow and then reading through your um, textbook and your readings, I think you have to understand that the change in art is often the result of political changes. Remember, people in the Hellenistic period aren't as politically involved. There is this separation between the people and the state that there wasn't in polis life. There was much more of a bureaucracy. So people were a little bit more disconnected from their government. It wasn't like 5th century Athens, where everybody, or at least the males, of course, could participate in the political process, and everything kind of revolved around that. Life in the Hellenistic period often ruled by a distant king, a monarch, or some distant ruler. So a lot of the times, political life was a little bit absent. So you have to kind of keep that in mind when we take a look at some of the art that's produced, because what we see is a shift away from some of these kind of political concerns of the earlier period, and more a turn to what we often call the everyday. So when we start to see some of the sculpture produced in the Hellenistic period in places in Greece, but then also in Egypt and Alexandria and Asia Minor and other places, we don't see so much these kind of timeless athletes, but rather these kind of everyday scenes. To give you a few examples here. Here is a statue called the Spinario. That's Spinario. And that just means it's the boy who's pulling the thorn out of his foot. So that's what you see what's going on here. Now, what's kind of interesting here is, remember, basically, especially when we get down to the classical period, most statues, they still worked in marble, but most statues would be made out of bronze. This allowed them kind of more flexibility in terms of how they're working, and so forth. And they're lighter, so that they could cut different poses and so forth. But what would happen is, of course, if there was a particular famous statue like the Dorophorus, or for example here, the Spinario, copies would be made, especially amongst Roman clients. And so a lot of these statues you see of Greek statues, they're actually Roman copies of the Greek original. And that's what happens here. You can see a Spinario here. There's a bronze one and a marble one. This is a very popular topic that are kind of seen that was replicated many times. So a lot of Romans would have this kind of statue in place. But I'm kind of blathering on here, but what the difference here is, if you compare this something to the Dorophorus, well, what we have here is a young boy, and what's he doing? Well, he's just, he's been walking through the garden or the fields or whatever. He has a thorn, so he's carefully just taking it out. So it's a much different scene. And as I say, the term that's often applied here is kind of everyday. It's not Zeus, it's not Poseidon. It's rather just this young boy who's doing a kind of scene that you'd see every day. This is really kind of typical. So this is the kind of thing that would be put in someone's garden, outside, or whatever. Another one that we'll see here, this is one that's often cited. It's two young girls, young women, and what they're doing is playing what's called knuckle bones. It's kind of like shooting dice, where there'd be kind of bones that you have to pick up in one throw and all that kind of stuff. I don't honestly know all the details, but they're just playing a street game, right? So this is the kind of scene you'd see, say, in the marketplace, the agora or whatever, in Alexandria, in Athens or whatever. So there's more interest in this kind of scene, right? It's not like these perfect athletes. It's just, and I say, I think you have to understand part of this because of because there's just not the same emphasis on political concerns. Okay, and here's one other one, right? Here's just a lady coming back from, say, the marketplace, carrying. It looks like she has a container of some sort, an amphora or something like that. But you can see that even her breasts are kind of exaggerated and so forth. I mean, it's not super high quality, but it's another kind of everyday scene. Another thing that this particular one kind of introduces is not that it's a kind of only an everyday scene, but again, if you take a look at the body with this kind of large belly, you can see her navel and the breasts kind of sagging down and so on. Remember, in the classical period, we looked at idealism, people in their kind of perfect form. Well, what we see in the Hellenistic period is a turn to realism, that is depicting people as they actually are. So take a look at this slide. What we have here on the right, of course, that's Pericles' classicism. Now, if you take a look at the left, it's a bronze head. That's very realistic, right? Just, it's obvious, right? Take a look, no wrinkles or anything. Here, the eyes would have been filled with some sort of gem or something, but take a look at the brow, all furrowed, bags under the eyes, kind of deep creases beside the nose, and even the mouth and so forth. This is often referred to as a philosopher, the idea being that the depiction of this person realistically helps to convey the idea that he's wise, right? Because he's lived a lot, he's older. And when we think of philosophers, we think of these kind of old, wise men that have lived through things. So this turn to realism also helps to kind of convey the subject. And this is another thing. We start to see attempts to, say, convey the individual. Whereas if we're trying to look at this as a portrayal of an individual, of Pericles. And honestly, it doesn't work that well because you have no sense of the person. It's just so perfected. So this is students often get confused of the difference between idealism and realism. So I'm really just emphasizing that now. Classicism on the right, that's idealism. On the left, Hellenistic, we see more of a turn to realism. Part of this is you can, as I say, talk about political changes, but some of it is just a taste, a change in taste. People, this had been perfected, right? Classicism had been perfected with the Dorophoros, the Parthenon. So artists are kind of looking to do something different, and we'll see this in other aspects as well. All right, and this is true of all artistic periods. There's kind of generational change where people, artists, something's, we saw this a little bit with Black and Red Figure. People want to do something different, right? So they kind of mark out new territory. Here's another one. This is just the head of an old lady, but just compare that to classicism. Right? I mean, check it out. Like her teeth are broken, wrinkles everywhere. But again, it gives you this real sense of somebody who is maybe at the end of life, have lived through so much. So it conveys that in a way that classicism really kind of can. So as to say, realism, a turn to the everyday, and realism, two very important developments in Hellenistic art. Here's another. This is probably one of the most famous pieces from the Hellenistic period. Part of the reason being that it's a bronze and it has survived. Most of the time, bronze breaks down in the elements, whether it be in the sea or if it was buried underneath earth in Greece or Rome. So they can break down quite a bit. But luckily enough, sometimes we find one that's kept in, say, a dry climate or something. And what this is a boxer. So what's interesting about this is that we're familiar with the depiction of athletes, right? Remember, we looked at the discobolos in the classical period, the man that was hurling a discus. And we talked about how when the Greek artists started to be able to depict movement in sculpture, then they show athletes, excuse me, because of course they're always moving around. But just to see how different this is in this period. So at first glance, the topic's the kind of the same, right? Okay, we have an athlete, all right, but he's not moving, he's kind of relaxing, so that's a little bit different. But when you see a close-up of him, we're going to see some interesting details. These will come out a little bit more in the next slide, but just to appreciate some of the details here. This is a boxer. Okay, and you can see he's wearing kind of ancient boxing gloves. Ancient boxing was a deadly sport. It's even worse than, say, today's ultimate fighting or whatever, because you'd bind up your hands not with gloves, but with leather straps with pieces of lead in there to do extra damage. So it was like hitting somebody with a lead glove. All right, so when we take a look closer to his face, you're going to see the differences here. So when you see his face is all beat up here, that's not the result of, say, time or the elements. This is how it originally was. It'd be better if you could see the eyes, if the gems were still there. But you can see that his nose is obviously being broken a number of times, just like when you see fighters today. Like, take a look at any UFC fighter. Most of their noses are kind of beaten in. You can see the cuts and so forth all over the place. He's got a cut on the bridge of his nose. He's got a cut on his cheek. He's got a cut in his forehead. And then you can also see he's got a bad case of cauliflower ear. Right? Take a look at any kind of wrestler, ultimate fighter, or even rugby player or whatever, depending on what position they play. You can see he's just been hit so many times on the ear that it's swollen up. So this is much different from the, say, the discobolos. The classical sculpture of the man throwing the discus. There it's like this 20-year-old person, perfect physique, absolutely no problems. Whereas this, we're seeing somebody that's much more realistic. And again, the idea is with reviewing this, we get more sense of the individual and also, say, the suffering that he's undergone. This person has been, maybe fighting for 5-10 years and he's just been put through hell. So it kind of helps to convey that aspect, a little bit more of the individual. So again, it's an athlete, so we're familiar with that topic, but it's just much more realistic. Okay? And quite often another popular thing is, not only did the artists like to show things realistic, but also, because this was a change from classicism, but also not only, say, young men, kind of young boys like the Spinaria, or old women like these women heading to the market, but they also took a look at non-perfect specimens, right? What's often referred to as the grotesque, just as an artistic rubric. And so what we have here, for example, this is actually a carving made out of ivory, but what it depicts is a hunchback. And hunchbacks actually became pretty common subjects in a lot of Hellenistic art. Now, already you can see, wow, this is dramatically different from the Parthenon or classical sculpture, where we see these perfect specimens. But now what we see is someone who is, contorted and deformed and so forth, has sort of congenital birth defects. So it's just something that you wouldn't have seen before. So that too, though, I think would have posed an interesting challenge to the artist, because you imagine an artist, a sculptor working in the Hellenistic period, you could say, do you want to do a perfect athlete? Well, no, because it's already been done. How about something like this? Well, that's a little bit different. That hasn't been done. So there is an interest in the grotesque. Okay, and don't think of the grotesque being, oh, that's so gross. It's just something that's a little bit off the norm or whatever. Another one, this is very famous. It's a sleeping figure, right? Now, the statue itself is ancient. This mattress below, it's like a bed, was actually added by the Roman sculptor Bernini at a later date. But when you look at this, right, you think to yourself, oh, it's a reclining lady or whatever, sexy, nude or whatever. But then when you walk around to the other side, you can see right there that what we have here is a hermaphrodite. That is someone who has the sexual characteristics of both a man and a woman. This is a myth from Greece, of course. Hermaphrodite. Hermaphroditus is the offspring of Hermes and Aphrodite. And of course, just as those names are brought together, then of course the male and female characteristics are brought together too. But what's interesting here, we could consider this, again, you wouldn't see something like this in the Parthenon, right? But it's just something a little bit different. You also see them kind of maybe playing with the viewer a little bit, right? The idea, okay, from this side it's one thing, and you go to the other side, it changes. So you see a little bit of experimentation in that side too. Next up is another, along with that boxer, this is another statue that's kind of often referred to when we're talking about Hellenistic art. It's called the Laocoon, Laocoon. This depicts a scene from the Trojan War myths. What happens is Laocoon, the central figure here, he's a Trojan priest. And when the Trojan horse is brought up to the gates of Troy, there's discussion amongst the Trojans about what they should do. Should they bring it in or shouldn't they? Of course, we know that there's Greeks inside, but they don't. Some people say bring it in, some people don't. Laocoon, the priest, is one of the people that says we should maybe be a little bit suspicious. So what he does is he takes his spear and he throws it in against the belly of the wooden horse, and it kind of reverberates, it kind of clangs. Now this should suggest to the viewers that this is an empty horse and there might be something in it. But the gods have kind of prophesied or foretold that Troy must fall. So that horse has to get into the city. Okay, so what Apollo does is he sends down these two serpents to kill Laocoon and his boys, his sons, as depicted here. And when this is a great description of Virgil of these snakes coming across the sea and entangling Laocoon and his sons. And when the other Trojans see this, then they, of course, hurriedly try to get the horse into the city because they think, Laocoon has offended the gods, so they have to do, in a sense, the opposite of what he argued. So that's what's being depicted here, right? Laocoon, this priest of Apollo, and his two sons being killed by these two serpents that are sent down. So this doesn't really kind of fit into the everyday. It's a scene of myth, but it's still much different from what we saw in the classical period. One thing is that it's a group. That is, there's three figures here, plus the serpents. We didn't really see much of that in the classical period, right? Maybe a little bit on the Parthenon, but in terms of freestanding sculpture, we didn't. So there is an improved interest in groups. And then, of course, what happens with groups is it opens up all sorts of different viewing angles and things to focus on. That's why, for example, just walking around this statue, it's in the Vatican, you can look at this part, you can look at this, all sorts of different things. So it just opens up more, say, viewing angles. So groups were another kind of important, group sculptures were another important development of the Hellenistic period. Another thing that's kind of interesting is if you take a look at the aspect of Laocoon's face, you see the agony that he's going through, right, with these serpents biting into him and strangling him. So you just see the suffering in his mouth and his brow and his eyes and so forth. You can imagine him screaming out in pain. So even this display of emotion is much different from the classical period, because remember there's no emotion, right? So again, this is idea of, we saw this a little bit with the realism, kind of conveying the individual, the person, but here it's more kind of conveying the actual episode itself, the terror and the fear and the pain that Laocoon's going with. Now, let's say with classical sculpture, you can't really do that. So you see these artists kind of exploring different aspects, right? So groups, psychological states such as terror or pain, artists were kind of striving for this. I should have included this earlier, but here's a good thing, this is just from a different angle. It just shows you when you walk around the statue, how you can appreciate it from so many different angles. So again, this is what Hellenistic artists are looking on. It's a great, great piece. Really, really fascinating. The last thing I want to talk about here kind of touches upon a few of the issues that we've discussed so far. Again, if we look back to the Archaic period, remember we're taking a look at these female and male statues. We talked about them a little bit and how they developed. This one's kind of mid-development, where it's a little bit more rounded off, but not naturalistic. But remember, the main difference between these is that the males are always nude, the females are always clothed. And we talked about textile production and even some the questions of chastity and virtue and all that kind of stuff, for the reasons for this being so. But what this meant is, and then we take a look through all classical sculpture, Greek artists had lots of time to explore and to try out depicting the nude male, right? From the very beginnings, right through the classical period, when you take a look at the Discobolos, the Doryphoros, and all that kind of stuff. Women, on the other hand, they had never really explored the female nude body. It was kind of an unexplored topic for artists at this time. Remember, back in classical Greece, it just wasn't really kind of focused on, right? But now they're like, well, they've perfected the kind of male body. Well, what about the female one? So what we start seeing are female nudes, right? Because this is something I hadn't done before. So this is, everybody knows this, right? The Venus de Milo, or the Aphrodite of Milos, as originally called. Aphrodite, of course, is the Greek name of Venus, and Milo just means from Milos. That's a Greek island. Now, she's missing her arms, right? But again, if I had shown you this and said, okay, is this, classical? You'd probably say, well, it's weird because it's a female nude. We haven't seen that before, right? Well, that's just because these artists at the time were like, okay, let me try something different now. So we start to see all sorts of them. Right, here's another one. These are often seen as described as a bathing Aphrodite. And what's interesting, a lot of them have this. Remember, we looked at Greek marriages in those water pots? Well, that's what we see here. It always has this water pot, so that symbolizes that she's bathing. And the idea here is, you can see she's covering up her breasts and or vagina or whatever. And so she's the idea here is that she's being kind of caught unaware. That is, she's kind of getting ready to get in the bath and somebody's kind of interrupted, so she's trying to cover up. So again, it's this idea of trying to kind of create a scene and some sort of emotional reaction rather than just this perfect body. All right, so we see a lot of female nudes, and other ones that seem to kind of combine a lot of these things. So what we have here is, you can see this nude figure, and what she's doing is she's fighting off a satyr. Remember, satyrs are kind of half man and half goat. That's why he has horns and hoofs for feet or whatever. And he's basically trying to rape her, right? But then here, so it's a kind of a mixture of the female nude. There's some sort of eroticism, but then also the grotesque with this kind of creature that's half man and half beast trying to rape somebody. So it's it's just, I couldn't really imagine seeing this in the classical period, right? And I even think she's holding her sandal trying to beat him off. So when we take, I find Hellenistic art just fascinating. This, you obviously got to go on and on about it, but this is just kind of hits some of the key points. So what I want you to take away is not only first of all, I'd say, how does it differ from classical art? All right. Some of the changes in concerns. So as I've kind of summarized here, some of the distinctive elements of Hellenistic art are, first of all, the themes are more the everyday rather than these great scenes from myth, right? So for example, remember in the Parthenon, it's like the birth of Athena. Well, no, now we have people pulling thorns out of their feet or whatever. There's more realism. So we see people kind of aged or drunk. There's a greater interest in the grotesque. There's more interest in groups, especially how that can have an effect on viewing angles and so forth, and a real interest in the erotic too. Not only say with the female body, but in that last statue we saw, but we see other examples of kind of erotic scenes because this hadn't been explored either. So we know that, and then also how it differs from classical art, but then also be familiar with how this change in the interests, that is the kind of things artists were creating for clients and for customers, reflects just this new kind of attitude, if you will, in the Hellenistic period and some of the kind of changing political circumstances. No doubt this helps to account for at least some of the changes in art since the classical period. Okay.